Hey everyone, Wazoo here with Wazoo Web Bites, and this is a special episode. Today we're going to be talking about interview questions. Yeah, I thought it would kind of be a neat little thing to go through and react to several spring interview question videos that are out there. I found a lot when I just Googled it right now on YouTube. I haven't watched any of these yet, and I think it might be a neat exercise to go through a few of them and see what comes up in terms of what these people consider or what these channels consider to be the most important spring interview questions and answers. It's you get a really mixed bag, and some of these, based on the published date, they're quite a few years old. A few of them, so I think we're going to have some varying questions, but I'm still interested. I'm still interested to see what we can pick out in terms of these interview questions. What I'm hoping to see, I guess, going in. Let's set some groundwork here before we get into some of these videos. I've been along, I'm sure, with you, whoever's watching this. You've probably been at some point in your life responsible for finding new work, and finding work is a job in and of itself, as we all often joke about, but it's totally true. It seems to take a whole lot of time to do the research on a company you're interviewing with or looking at. Even getting calls back from other companies is a real chore, and it can take a tremendous amount of time. I can't be alone when I've applied places and I don't hear from them for 3 months, and then suddenly out of the blue I'll get six responses back, right? Like 3 months later. That's pretty much the norm for me for most places. So, um, don't, if that's happened to you, don't think you're alone. And it's mentally very taxing going through and looking for work. It's not, in the movies, it's like, oh, you bump into a guy at the bar, and next thing you know, you're CEO, right? Like, it almost, well, it's never worked that way for me. So, even with the amount of contacts I've developed over the years of my career and my network, it's never been that quick. Even when I have a quote unquote in at a company, it still takes at least a month to go through interview processes and things like that. So, but so that in mind, what I'm looking for in these interview questions and answers is, firstly, a video that doesn't waste my time. So, like, if I'm looking for work, I'm going to put myself in the context of, I'm going to pretend that I'm looking for work when I'm viewing these videos here with you, and I don't want to watch an entire video, an hour long video or however long it is, and the questions are buried, maybe three-quarters of the way through, just to make sure that that person gets a view, right? Or that channel gets a view. I think it would be a lot cooler, and I would respect the channel a lot more if there was chapter markers everywhere throughout the video for the questions that they're after, or if it's an old video, then maybe like a breakdown right up front as to what kind of questions they're tackling throughout the video. I think that would be a really good idea. So if you're out there and you're looking to create your own, for content, spring interview Q&A, then I would recommend using chapters. Make full use of YouTube chapters. Have a breakdown up front of what you're going to be covering. Just basically put yourself in the shoes of somebody really looking for work. Don't treat it as, I'm making content and I need to get a click. I would rather watch something where it's something that's put together by someone who's been there plenty of times looking for work themselves, and showcases the elements and questions that are relevant, right? And I guess another point is, I would, right now, at least, I'm not going to be going through any microservice questions. I know Spring Boot, there is a huge microservice sort of field of expertise with using Spring Boot. But I'd like to just stay within sort of Spring Boot, and I guess maybe by association, it means the Spring Framework. So, but let's just see what we can see. Let's get into it. So as you can see here on YouTube, I've just typed in Java Spring interview questions, and I'm just going to go through thumbnails and go pick a few, and let's maybe skim through them and see what we can what we can find. Okay, so the first one is from Edureka. Spring interview questions and answers, Spring tutorial, Spring framework training. Okay, let's give this a shot.
Hello friends, so very warm welcome. This is Ishan on behalf of Edureka. So we are supposed to discuss some interview questions related to the Spring framework for the day. So let's begin the session, and I hope
So this sounds like a webinar. Just already the presentation, the audio, it kind of strikes me that this was put together as a webinar. So hopefully there's at least a little bit. I do see some chapter markers. Maybe we can.
Java Enterprise Edition. So Spring framework plays one. This is very basic question when you are
Okay,
going
so
to
what is a
start
Spring
with
framework?
interview, right? So the technical. So what do you know?
So I guess right away, if I'm getting a question like what is the Spring framework, I would be really concerned, to be honest, as to the company that I'm going to be working for. I think questions like that. I mean, it's kind of like asking what is JavaScript, what is React, what is that kind of thing, and I don't know. The interview, although they the interview is really also an opportunity for you to interview the company as to the place that you'll be spending time at and doing work for. So if you're also evaluating them based on the questions that they're asking you. So yeah, I would be pretty concerned right away if the first question is what is the Spring framework.
Framework, or what exactly is Spring framework? Now that's like the primary question which you might face. Session management and database handling part, right? So JDBC, etc. and etc. We can do a lot of things in data.
Okay, so features of the Spring framework. Maybe that's a good question to be asking. As this channel sort of highlights here, it's lightweight. Topics, lightweight. I don't know. You could argue either way. Inversion of control. That's a very popular feature of Java Spring. Aspect oriented. It's container focused. MVC framework friendly. Transaction management, and is that JDBC exception handling? I think that's what it is underneath the
Spring framework. So let's see what and all are the modules available in the Spring framework and what exactly they are, right? So guys, Spring framework is a layered architecture. So it's basically a layered architecture. So layers can interact with each other, right? So in the upper direction, the lower direction. So the rock bottom layer is a test.
Okay, so this is a good breakdown. I think this is a really good description of what's going on with the Spring framework and how it's set up and how Spring Boot sort of plugs into and works and integrates with the rest of the Spring framework and its modules. So I think this would be a good sort of drawing diagram to copy locally and get yourself just at least be able to visualize when you're describing it to a potential employer.
Testing layer, that's like you can have JUnit testing, or you can have unit testing using JUnit. Even you can have integration testing, right? Then we got the core container, which is the help of a third-party web framework.
So before I know I'm pausing a lot. Before I even get going, I did want to shout out to Edureka. Hopefully I said that right. Edureka for at least providing some chapter navigation in the bottom here. I think that's great. So I'll definitely give that thumbs up.
Then we can use it if we are supposed to do any remote, invocations. Then we got enterprise Java beans. So wrapping up the existing plain old Java objects, right? So
okay, I'm gonna try and find some Spring Boot focused. These are real, more general Spring framework type of questions. Okay, maybe something here on describe Spring DAO
comes
support.
with the data access support, right? So we got all DAO as a design pattern concept, which can be used of in our Spring framework. So Spring framework data access is aimed at making it easy to work with the data access technologies like Hibernate, that is JDBC or JDO, right? Java Data Objects. So it's very easy to switch between the persistent technology. So you can.
Yep, this is a good question, I think, and a good explanation. Although in practice, I haven't been at very many places that switched between data providers. Once they've picked one, either using Hibernate, JDBC, or JDO, they've pretty much just stuck with that permanently. So the old argument when I did start Java development way ages ago, the old argument was that you could switch easily between providers, but in practice, that almost never happens. But what do I know? That's just my experience. Maybe you've been at a place where they've actually gone through the exercise of perhaps switching from MySQL to Postgres, something like that. And keeping in mind that this was recorded on 2017. Okay, let's keep going.
One of the framework to the other framework very easily. So code without worrying about catching the exceptions that are specific to each technology. So you can write a very beautiful independent code. So what are the various?
Okay, let's check out.
We got different aspects of the application.
Okay, so I think this one is a fairly important question. It's probably quite a general one that's on many interviews. Is what do you mean by Spring MVC framework? And so this is again an explanation for the breakdown in terms of the communication between the dispatcher servlet and your various views, controllers, etc. So I think this would be a good question and answer to also go through and study.
Which are separated now. So you can see over here, we got dispatcher servlet as one of the key important ingredient. We got the mapping, handler mapping, controller, view resolver, and view. So these are the various components. Let's see what are these guys. So guys, dispatcher servlet is the one which will handle any HTTP request or response. So Spring MVC framework is designed around the dispatcher servlet only. So what is this web application context? So web application context is again an extension of application context. So application context is the core container, whereas web application context is a container on the web app layer, right? So this will have an extra feature for your web applications. So it is also capable.
I think in the later versions of Spring, I don't think this is true any longer. I think there's been some slight change in this hierarchy of context, so I would be a little bit careful about something like this. But also, I think the dispatcher servlet is far more important to understand than the web application context. That's just my own opinion. Okay, let's keep going. Let's see. Okay, we're right at the end. So that was it for Edureka. I think there were some good questions, Q&A there. I kind of zipped through a lot of them, but I didn't want to kind of get bogged down through watching entire videos. So let's try this one here. Top Spring interview questions and answers for freshers and experienced. Freshers, that's cool. Code Decode. All right. So this is one year ago, so this is fairly recent.
Hey guys, welcome to Code Decode. Today we're going to start with Spring interview questions. Well, as usual, we'll start with basics and then we will go into a very deep level where we're going to understand each and every aspect of Spring, including AOP, the point cuts and everything. So stick with me. Let's get started.
Okay. We're sticking.
So the very first question that you may be asked in an interview is the very basic one. What is Spring Framework? So it's nothing but an open source Java, like web or project or application.
Let's see if there's any.
Now you will be asked, what is
no
the
captions
features
available
of
for this
Spring
one.
Framework? So this is a very important question.
Okay, so this is the same breakdown. What is the Spring Framework? The same 7, 2, 4, 6. Yeah, it's the same 6 or 7 feature bullet points that we saw in the Edureka video, which is a great. Again, if you can remember at least a couple of these, I think it'll take you a long way during the interview. But let's jump ahead. Let's try and get to some other questions.
You are going to resolve nothing but AOP. We are going to see the modules available in Spring Framework.
Okay, so again, a description of modules.
Feature to Spring, which will help your application messaging like queues and all. You need to I'll show everything in the live demonstration to you if the time permits. So what do you...
Okay, so this is an important question for Spring Boot and Spring in general is what do you mean by IOC, inversion of control? So let's hear what Code Decode has to say.
IOC is nothing but inversion of responsibility of object creation, initialization and destruction. Basically the life cycle management from application to Spring container. So in the normal programming, what you have done, you have created object with new keyword. In Spring, we don't do that. We give it to Spring container. You do everything. We will just sit back and we will just use your beans that you have created. So I'll quickly show you how we have done. So if I have a demonstration for you, I'll create a package called as engine car demo. That will be good. Okay, now what I can do is I can quickly create a class which is car, and
it's pretty cool that Code Decode is going through a explanation of IOC with a code sample. I think that's a great idea.
Another class which is engine. Now I want to use engine in my car. So what I have always done in normal programming life, I have created engine object like this equals to new engine, and suppose my engine has some name. So public string name. What is my name? I can say hi, I am 1.5 liters VTEC engine. Simple. A simple name to my engine. I want to use this engine in my car. How can I do that? So engine dot name, simple, and I can just print it up. So basically now my car has an engine, and when I try to print it, okay, I'll also print in car. In car class. Okay, I'll quickly run this. And let's see, this was the basic way. In car class, hi, I am 1.5 liter VTEC engine. So it was the car. I want to use engine. I used to do it using new. Now, once I'm done with this, garbage collector used to collect it. So basically, the object creation, it's managing and everything is done by me. I don't want to take this all on me. That is why Spring came into picture. So how do you do in the Spring part? So let me quickly create a new Spring startup project for you, and I'll be using Java 8 only right now, and I can do the same as demo engine only.
Okay, let's see this one.
What I can do is in my car, if I want to have it, I'll first create it as a component. I've made sure that this is a bean now. So Spring container is going to come and see, okay, this is @ component. That means it is a bean. I should be creating a bean and I should be handling it, and I should be creating the singleton object of this engine. Now I want that my car should have it. So I will be using auto wired of engine, and I'm going to use @ component here also, so that even car's bean is created. Now I'm going to have my method public string get engine data. Simple. Now my car should have the engine data return. So return engine dot name. Simple. So when I create a bean of car, I should have my engine auto-wired as a dependency in car, and when I call this method from this car bean, I should get the engine name which is auto-wired into car. And how do I do that? A simple way to do that is spring.run is going to return me something called as configurable application context. So I'm just going to take that context and I'm just going to import the configurable application context. So this is nothing but, if you remember, application context is nothing but a part of core container, if you remember. Now from this context, I'm going to get bean. And I'm going to name it as car.class. If I do that, I should have the car object returned to me. Now if I have that, I should be able to print the engine of car. So car dot get engine data. And if I run it, let's see, does this particular thing runs for us? So let's see the console and see
Wow, that's pretty cool. That was a really great explanation and breakdown by Code Decode. Good one, good one. So that clearly highlights and demonstrates how important IOC is in version of control. So if you're not new to servers, or if you're new to Java Spring Boot and you come across this concept and you're not really sure of what this means, this was a really good breakdown from Code Decode. So the programmer, to kind of just reiterate what she was saying, is that you no longer are in control of creating and destroying, or not destroying, creating and managing the objects that you need to. You just hand them over to Spring, and it will do all the work for you of making sure that objects are getting instantiated and created for you for your application. So bravo, Code Decode. That was a really great breakdown. That's definitely a good Spring interview question and answer. Okay, let's go back to our list. And let's try this one. Spring interview questions and answers from the channel in 28 minutes. So 7 years ago, which again gives me a little bit, oh, you know what? Let's try, okay. We'll do this one, and then we'll do this 7 most popular Spring interview questions. So let's try this one, okay.
Hi there, welcome to this video on interview questions related to Spring.
So again, no chapter markers. Hopefully there's a little bit of a breakdown right up front here.
From javainterview.in. Spring is one of the most famous Java frameworks. We start with dependency injection and we see why Spring is so popular. I mean, why is Spring so popular? Why are so many projects using Spring? I mean, we look at what are the different modules which are present in Spring, and then we would look at different versions of Spring, the major features which are present in there, and we talk about things like auto-wiring, annotation-based configuration, and
okay, so this channel breaks down all of the questions that we're going to cover in this video, and it's I would say it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but it's also on a good interview, some good interview material here.
How does it happen? And we'll move on to things like stateful beans and stuff like that, and validations. We'll move on to aspect-oriented programming, which is really a very good thing about Spring. And then we would move on to things like JDBC and how do you do test with Spring. And at the end, we'll look at how you can integrate Spring with a set of different frameworks. Okay, that's quite a lot to cover. Let's get
That's a huge amount in only 40 minutes. Okay, let's see what happens here.
started. First, why is Spring so popular? Let's look at the most important feature of Spring. Now, look at this particular piece of code. We have a client BOIMPL.
Okay, so let's skip ahead to the next one. I think if you're being interviewed for Spring, then the company's already chosen Spring, and there's no really need to go over why it's so popular, at least in my opinion.
I mean, this client BOIMPL, I would do something. So what Spring said is, instead of giving this class, I want to give it something to the client BOIMPL on product DO. But it's not creating the dependency itself. What it's relying on is on the Spring framework. Spring framework would find a implementation of this particular class, and it will provide it to this. So the most important thing.
Okay, again, that's the concept of dependency injection that we saw in the previous video already.
Is at a later point in time. Let's say I want to write my unit test. I want to write my integration test. Instead of providing the product DO, the real implementation, I can provide a mock implementation or a stub implementation, and I don't need to change the code for it. All the changes would happen in the configuration. It would happen in the Spring XML. So thereby, just by changing the Spring XML, I can change the code to work with a stub instead of working with a real interface. And that's the concept due to which Spring has become really famous. This concept is called dependency injection. And this concept is also called inversion of control. because earlier the control was with the client BOIMPL. The client BOIMPL used to do something of this kind. So it used to create the DOIM.
Okay, so just to reiterate again, inversion of control, exactly what we saw in the code decode video, where instead of you needing to worry about creating and instantiating objects, you hand it back to Spring and let it do it during initialization and creation.
MPL itself. So it's really the reason framework. It's called Spring AOP, but Spring doesn't force you to use it. You have the option to go for Aspect J, which is quite a really famous aspect-oriented programming framework. It has provided. That's why it's called IOC, inversion of control. So that's like the core functionality of Spring is the Spring IOC framework. So this Spring dependency injection framework is really the core, and it's really the reason why Spring has become really famous.
Yes, agreed.
And the second reason why Spring has become really famous is it has provided integration with a lot of other frameworks. So Spring, for example, provides its own aspect-oriented programming framework. It's called Spring AOP, but Spring doesn't force you to use it. You have the option to go for Aspect J, which is quite a really famous aspect-oriented programming framework. So with Spring, you have the flexibility. You can choose whether you want to go for Aspect J or whether you want to use the basic features, aspect-oriented programming features which are present in Spring. Spring has its own MVC framework.
This is a lot of technical details. Nice one. So it's hopefully this guy has a ton of water nearby to take some drinks in between some of this explanation.
Spring MVC, but it doesn't force you to use it. Spring has really good integration with struts too. So you do not need to use Spring MVC because you are with Spring. So that's the flexibility which Spring framework offers. It allows you to choose other frameworks. It has, and also Spring is really good at deciding what it's good at and what it's not. For example, Spring creates an abstraction over the JDBC called Spring DAOs. So that's good, but it doesn't really go into the JPA space. I mean, it doesn't go and try and create a framework of its own for replacing Hibernate, because they realize that Hibernate is really a good framework and creating something as good as Hibernate is really tough. So what they do is they provide good integration with Hibernate. So whatever you want to do with Hibernate, you can integrate it with Spring easily. So that's the three main reasons why Spring is so famous. A, dependency injection. B, it knows what it needs to do, and it provides really good integration with other frameworks. And third is it gives you a lot of flexibility. Now that we understood
Yep, that's a good list. That's a good top 3 list of using Spring Framework.
Dependency injection and the core of the Spring's functionality, which is dependency injection and inversion control, we would really move on to other topics now. We would start looking into all the other modules which are present in Spring. Let's get started. What are the different modules which are present in
Okay, so I'm going to skip over the modules part. That's been the same in all the other videos as well. So let's skip ahead.
Spring framework? Which allows us to write really good unit tests. And the configuration and the code is concept together, and that with annotation possible. All the important modules which are present in Spring. Now let's look at an important question. What was the changes in different versions of Spring? This like at a high level.
I don't know if it's too important in terms of knowing what the different major features are between the different versions of Spring, just because that's something that you should be able to easily find on the Spring website. So if I'm your boss, and I would rather that you would be able to find it on the Spring Boot website, and when needed for whatever project we're working on, instead of memorizing what the different changes are. But let's see what Java Interview has to say here.
The most important change in Spring 2.5 was it made annotation-driven configuration possible. annotations is a great way. I mean, if I have a large Spring XML, I mean, if I have a Spring XML of 1,000 lines of code, it's very difficult to maintain. And that's where annotations came in. And with annotations,
Okay, that's a really good point. Annotations do make a heck of a lot of difference in Spring Boot code, as you've seen in a lot of the projects that we've tackled on this channel. I've made heavy use of annotations wherever possible just to keep the amount of boilerplate down to a minimum.
I can write, like I can make the annotation right at the place where the code is, and the configuration and the code is directly tied together. And that was a great way of doing things. Spring 2.5 introduced annotations, and it actually caused a lot of reduction in terms of the number of lines of XML which is written. Like I really like the annotations concept with Spring 2.5.
Yep, agreed.
Spring 3.0 was the was a big release in terms of the Spring framework, and it made use of all the features which were introduced as part of Java 5. Java 5 came in with a lot of features, generics, new for loops, variable arguments. A lot of features were part of Java 5, and Spring 3.0 made sure that Spring doesn't go behind. I mean, when there are new features in Java 5, you'd want to implement those features into your framework. I mean, your framework should be making the best use of those features so that it's efficient as possible, and Spring framework did it. And Spring 4.0 is the latest version, I mean latest major version I can say, and it supports all the Java 8 features. I mean Java 8 features.
Spring 4 latest. Okay, what video or when was this made? Okay, must be a while ago. But let's.
Java 8 is again a big Java release because it came up with this concepts of functional programming, streams, lambda expressions, and things like that. And Spring 4.0 really supports all of them. And also one thing to remember, if you are going to use Spring 4.0, the minimum Java version you'd need is Java 6. So if you are not yet on Java 6, you are still on Java 5, then don't go for Spring 4.0. So those are the things about different versions of Spring. Next, I mean, this is kind of a trivial thing. I mean, what are the latest specifications? You can look up.
Yeah, again, questions like this, I've rarely seen, just because you can easily look this up on the Spring website, depending on the version of Spring that you're trying to hunt down.
That on the screen and pause and look at them. This is also kind of the favorite question. I mean, WebSocket, by the way, for WebSockets, it started, Spring 4.1 introduced this J4 form for convert an object to a JSON. Auto wiring is the feature which enables the automatic finding of dependencies. So what is...
Yeah, so auto wiring is behind the concept of inversion of control and dependency injection that we've seen already in a couple of examples. But it is a good important question to make sure you know how, at least what kind of an answer to give if someone asks it.
Auto wiring. Basically, what I'm saying here, let's say this is a client BO IMPL. So what I'm telling Spring by putting this service at service annotation is this is one bean. So I'm saying client BO IMPL is a bean which is available. You can, if somewhere this client BO is there and you need an implementation for client BO, then client BO IMPL might be the right choice for it. You are seeing here auto-wired product DO. So what it does is whenever it finds an implementation of product DO, what Spring does is it gets the implementation and directly wires it in here. So this is what is called auto wiring. So auto wiring is done by putting an annotation at auto wired. You should make sure that there is an at service or an at component annotation on the product DO IMPL. So on the product DO IMPL, you need to have a at service or at component, defining it as a component which the Spring can manage, defining it as a bean which Spring can manage. And once Spring finds that the product DO IMPL,
I don't know, this is quite a long explanation. I think I would, again, just point back to the earlier example that Java Interview put together in this video around dependency injection. and explaining auto-wired that way through that mechanism.
MPL also implements the same interface product DO. AutoWire would go and or add the default scope for that bean is singleton. A singleton is something which only one instance can exist in the JVM. So whenever you create a Spring Bean, it's a singleton. And there's a little difference from the usual singleton pattern in the sense that usually singleton pattern is one instance per JVM, but in Spring it's one instance per application context. So inside the Spring application context XML, the Spring Bean is a singleton. So if you really don't want to use a singleton, and if you want to use different beans in the same application context, then you can use something called a prototype. So prototype would help you to avoid a bean being a singleton and being shared across every request. So you can put a scope is equal to prototype, then the prototype scope comes into picture.
Yeah, I don't know if I would bother, at least in this answer, if you're trying to describe this yourself in a question to an interview, I don't know if I would even bother going into what a prototype is. I think I would just stick to what a Java bean is in Spring Boot and how it treats it as a singleton and what that means. But otherwise, it's a good break. I mean, technically, Java interview is right.
There would be a different instance of bean created at every request. For each request for this particular bean, then a new instance of this bean would be created. So if I made this particular bean as a prototype, so if I do product DOIMPL as a prototype, then every time client DOIMPL asks for a product DOIMPL, a new instance of product DOIMPL will be created. By default, the same instance of product DOIMPL will be reused again and again and again. By default, it's singleton. If you really want to make a change, you need to make it a prototype. This is not a really good example for prototype. The next favorite question of interviewers is, how do you really configure property files in a XML? So I have a property file called database connection.properties, and it holds all the
I think for something like this, these days, I rarely see any questions on XML. It's all focused around either YAML, the .yml format for defining your application.properties, or just a regular properties file itself. So I'm sure they're still out there. A lot of the original Spring Boot projects were making heavy use of XML. So perhaps you're maintaining such a project right now.
values. I mean, what is the URL? What is the path?
But this is no different than updating a property within the application.properties file. So you find the property value, the IDE helps you define, resolve the correct path into the whole Spring configuration, and it lets you update it through that.
Word and all that kind of stuff. Okay, this is not really a good example because you don't want to really store username and passwords in a property file.
And yeah, that's a really great, excellent point. And it's something that you should mention in an interview, even though everybody quote unquote knows it, is that you should never put usernames and passwords in the property files or anywhere in your source code, like checked into any source control. That should be all handled either. There's various techniques, like things like environment files or actual command. You can pass it in on the command line when you start the Spring Boot container, or inject them via environment files, as I just mentioned. Instead of it definitely shouldn't be defined anywhere in a properties file that you've checked into source control.
Typically, a data source is used in this situation, but just for the sake of example, is by using this property file here. The next one is, how is validation done using Spring Framework? The most important thing about the Spring validation is the Spring validation classes that you create can be used both in the business layer as well as in the web layer. So when I want to validate something which a user enters, I can do that in the web layer using this class. And also when I want to validate something in the business layer, I can do that too. If I want to validate an incoming request to a web service, I can do that using Spring Validator too. And so it's very flexible framework. I can use Spring Spring Framework to validate a lot of things. I mean, there is no tie-up with a web thing in here. So that's the most important thing. The implementing a validator class in Spring is very simple. So let's say I want to implement a validator for a car. I want to validate that there is a name object. The name is not empty, and the value for used years is not negative. So let's say those are the two things I would want to validate. So you just have to implement the validator interface which Spring provides, and say like this, implement two important methods which are present in the validator interface.
I think if I was trying to describe this in an interview question, I would have skipped all that first bit and just started right away with implementing your own validator for a Spring Boot object.
One is the support method. The support method says which kinds of classes you can validate here. So this car validator can validate only the car class. It cannot validate an array list class, for example, or a Jeep class, for example. So that's what you are saying with the supports method. And the next one you need to define is the actual validate method. So you take in the object is the car object. So once you have this car object, Spring provides a number of validation utils. It provides an
So yeah, I think if you're not following along in the example, if it's kind of going your head, the code, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think what I would focus more on is just understanding the concepts. Like, for example, you would know how to find this and look this up if you had to during your job, right? But during the interview, I would hope that there's a little bit more focus on just sort of talking about the concept of what a validator is and how it functions in Spring Boot at a non-code higher level. Because all this stuff is easy to, quote unquote, easy to Google in either the Spring documentation or on other websites when you're actually doing the work. So, but when you're trying to describe this during an interview, I mean, you're not going to be going through code like this. At least that's my opinion.
Methods which are present in the validation through an error messages to real text. So you can say, instead of stuff validate in your business layer, you can do anything with the validation, which all web applications, for example, are based on layers. So you have a web layer, you have a business layer, you have a data layer. Data layer takes care of talking to the database. Business layer is where all your business logic is, and the web layer takes care of all the communication, forms, validation of the forms, and sending data to the business layer and all that kind of stuff. So these are the three layers which are typically present in a web application. There are things which are common to these three layers. For example, logging. You do logging in all the three layers. So that's a cross-cutting concern. Security. You'd want to make sure that your web layer is secure, and you'd also want to make sure that your business layer is secure and the data layer is secure. So security is another cross-cutting concern. Transactions might be another cross-cutting concerns. You want to implement transaction with multiple layers. So you want to start from business layer and also cover the data layer as part of your transaction. So these are typically examples of cross-cutting concerns.
That's a good list to kind of memorize. That's a good breakdown by Java interview. Yeah, that's a good point. It's trying to explain what does cross-cutting mean. Initially, when I would come across that term, my brain would kind of interpose. No, what's that term? Transpose cost cutting with cross cutting. So I would be thinking of cost cutting in terms of ways to trim down the Spring Boot project or slim down any functionality, etc. But this is more obviously this is more talking about what are the features or aspects of a Spring Boot application that touches every aspect of the engine. And so things like, as Java Interview just pointed out, things like logging, security, transaction, those are all cross-cutting measures in a Spring Boot application, or even any web application in general. Those are features that are sort of prevalent in every single layer.
So in Spring or in any application programming, typically you'll implement cross-cutting concerns using aspect-oriented programming. Aspect-oriented programming helps you to define how the cross-cutting concerns have to be implemented. This particular class, as we discussed earlier, has three public methods: get client product sum, save change products, and calculate and save client product sum. And every time these methods are called, I want to log the method call, with the parameters which are called. So I want to say something like logger.log message. I want to say this particular method is called with the parameters so and so. So that's what I want to print before every method. Don't worry about the performance impact and such things. Just take it as an example. I want to implement this kind of a functionality. So you want to, at the start of every method, you want to print what is the name of the method, and you would want to print the parameters which are passed to this particular method. So client ID and user enter products, and so on. So now you'd see that I would need to go to every method and implement that. So I have to, let's say, not only in this client BOIMPL, but there are actually 15 business classes which are present in this particular layer. And in all the 15 different classes, I want to do this logging. So I have to repeat the same code again and again and again. And that's where the aspect-oriented programming comes into picture. In aspect-oriented programming, you can say, I want to execute this code whenever this method is called. You can define how to identify this method. So I want to identify a method by, let's say, save star. So then if I say star.save star, this is not the exact syntax. Let's not worry about the exact syntax. That's something which you can easily find out. But if you say the point cut, which is defined in the AOP, is star.save star. So what happens is the code you define in that particular piece of code would be executed for any method which starts with save. Or if you say something like star.get star, so it means any method which starts with get, then this particular thing is called. The other things you can do is things like this. So
that's pretty important, and that's it. You can maybe tie it in with any JavaScript framework when you're explaining what aspect AOP is. I've already forgotten what what AOP stands for. I just keep seeing the shorthand version of that, but the idea is that it's very similar to a hook mechanism. So you can hook into methods that are all getter methods or setter methods, and then you can perform things like logging, and you can control all that from those very small hook handlers in your code base, instead of going into every single maybe controller function or etc. and updating sort of the logging there. So that's a really good point. That would be a good one to highlight and point out during your interview.
BOIMPL.get star. So it will only implement the get methods. It would only intercept the get methods in a class ending with BOIMPL. So you can say whenever this kind of a method gets called, the most important thing is this. All these should be Spring Beans. So if these are Spring Beans and method calls over the Spring Beans which are which are made through Spring Beans, then the AOP framework can intercept these calls. It can intercept this get call, and it can do something like, you can write code which makes sure that this thing is executed. So instead of save changed products, you can say something like method name, and you can say something like method params. So whenever there is this kind of a method being called, then do this. So that kind of thing which AOP allows. This particular thing which is used to identify which methods need to be intercepted, which method calls needs to be intercepted. This is called a point cut. And the exact code we are invoking. I mean, when we intercept this, we want to call this particular code. This is called an aspect. An aspect is a part of the concern we are trying to implement. So the most two important concepts are a point cut. A point cut is an expression which defines which are the methods which would be intercepted. I want to intercept every method which starts with get. I want to intercept methods made from.
So a point cut, just it is in very high level loose terms, it's kind of like a regex. Think of it as sort of a regex format for defining what functions you want to hook into, what kind of functions you want to hook into, and to do your whatever your AOP methods within it.
Every bean whose name ends with BOIMPL. This is called a point cut, and I want to log all the parameters that are passed to the method. I want to put a transaction management around it. That's basically the aspect part of it. So there are two parts, as we said. I'm repeating this because this is a little confusing for starters. So it's the first part is point cut. Point cut is basically defining which are the methods to be intercepted. The next part is called your aspect. And the aspect is what is the code, what is the functionality we are trying to implement, what is the concern which we are trying to implement in here. That's the aspect. So we have a point cut and we have an aspect. And an aspect oriented programming framework will allow you to define point cuts and apply aspects to it. Whatever you see on the screen right now is a good example of a logging aspect. So the way you define an aspect is by putting an annotation at aspect, and I'm saying.
So this is a good example of the concept. That way, it can highlight what you're trying to discuss in an interview. But again, I think this code is more for you and less to present during an interview, right? Like you even in a technical interview, you kind of more want to go through a higher level overview of what these terms mean, what this annotation means, and how it's kind of functioning in your application versus writing out code and getting exact syntax correct. So, but this is a good way to highlight to us, the viewer of this video, what a aspect is and what a point cut is.
This is where I define the point cut. So I'm saying before point cut, so before invoking the method, which method? That's defined by the point cut. Anything in the com_reto service package and anything whose method name starts with get. So any method which matches this pattern, before executing this, do this. So apply this advice, apply this aspect. So that's basically the thing which it does. So before calling any method in here, this particular piece of code is executed, and only then the actual method call will happen. So this is a very good example of aspect oriented programming, where I define the common functionality. Let's say logging. I want to log every method parameter. That's defined outside the class so that it's applied to every class which is there without I writing a piece of code for it. There is a little bit of performance impact because of aspect oriented programming, because the interception has to happen at runtime. But these days, with all the really good frameworks, the impact is really negligible. So aspect-oriented programming is really the preferred way to implement a lot of things related to cross-cutting concerns, transaction management, logging. All these are typically implemented using aspect-oriented programming. We'll look at a lot more examples. Earlier, we were talking about aspect-oriented programming. There are five different types of advices which are possible in aspect-oriented programming. That's basically, a before advice, after returning advice, after throwing advice, after finally advice, and around advice. So basically, around advice is the most flexible one. You can actually intercept a method call, and you can actually make the method call during the implementation of the around advice. So around advice is the most flexible ones. Before advice is called before calling the method. After advice is called after the method call. If the method throws an exception, then the after throwing advice is called. And this after finally advice. After advice is generally called whether a method returns something or whether throws an exception. So in both these situations, the after finally advice would be called. So those are the different types of AOP advices. The next question is typically how you would integrate Spring and Hibernate. So the integration of Spring and Hibernate is really easy. So either you can use a data source configuration.
It is pretty simple. And again, this is sort of an older style using the XML setup. Nowadays, it's with, through the application.properties or through a YAML file.
Or you can use, this is looking up from the JNDI. If you want to really create a local data source, we can use a configuration similar to the one earlier. So which we used in the example where we looked up database user ID and password from the property file. You can use that or this. And you can configure a Hibernate session factory and define the class of it as this. And then you can pass in the data source reference to it. So you create a session factory passing the data source reference and also all the mapping files. So how does how do you look up all the mapping files? So that's basically, so you have a list of table names in here which are provided. Let's say I have 100 mapping files. All the list of mapping files can be done in here, and also along with it you can map a property file as well. Here I'm specifying the property files directly. I'm saying I'm going to use SQL, but you can also provide a explicit property file which has all the Hibernate related properties. So this is how you integrate. You set up a session factory to integrate Spring and Hibernate. It's very easy to integrate Spring and Hibernate, and Spring has really excellent connections with JPA. The other option you would want to really look at is, instead of hard coding Hibernate, you can probably use JPA. So that's something which you can look up, see how you can integrate Spring with JPA. JPA is basically the interface. Java Persistence API is the interface which Hibernate implements. So JPA kinds of defines the common API which all ORM, object relational or object relational mapping frameworks like Hibernate.
So that's usually a interview question in and of itself, is what is an ORM and describe it. So if you're sort of missing the point that Java interview was saying, an ORM is a object relationship mapping, and it's a layer where you, as with other components of Spring, it's a provider definition for working with different data providers, and you just simply have to use the common language that each provider implements, and then you can just like with every other Spring component, you can plug in different providers. So Hibernate and Hibatus, and there was a couple of others, but they're very kind of similar there.
Will implement. So you can look up JPA, and you can actually directly integrate Spring with JPA and use Hibernate as the implementation as well. That's an option as well. Implementing caching with the Spring framework is also very simple. First thing you need to do is enable caching. So that's how you do it. So you just say at enable caching, and that means caching is enabled in this particular application context. This can also be done in the XML configuration as well, but like if you have a Java based configuration, then you can also define the annotation at enable caching, and it would enable caching. And then you can go and put the cacheable annotation, on all the things which you would want to cache. So here the find player method, the results from it would be cached. So the player ID would be the key, something based on the player ID would be the key, and the results would be cached. There are a lot of features to control this cache which are provided by Spring. One thing is conditional caching. You can say if the name.length is less than 32, only then cache it, otherwise don't really cache it. And also you can put something to the cache to update the existing value. So you can define a cache put annotation to say this value is already in the cache, but I would want to really update it. So that's what the cache put does. And you also have the,
I think if I was to kind of go through this for an interview, I would maybe first start with like, why is caching important? What is this? Why are we bothering to make these code changes with this annotation? What is caching doing for us? And I mean, I think I would just start it with something simple, like it's caching just helps speed up reads to the database. So instead of constantly looking up the same data, you can look it up once, and it's now cached read only for other objects in your application. So provided that's not an object that changes very often, then you can speed up that kind of access to your application. So again, maybe just go through and highlight what the more higher level benefits of caching are and how you might implement it in Spring Boot, but don't worry too much about the actual code for that.
Feature of cache evict, that's basically to remove something from the cache. So let's say the delete player method is there and delete player takes the player ID as the input. I can put an @cache evict on the delete player method so that I can remove the player from the cache. Otherwise, if the player is deleted and I have cached it, then there's a chance that when I call the find players method, it will take it from the cache and return it back, and that's not good to happen because the player is already deleted. So I can remove it from the cache by using the @cache evict annotation. So these are the features which are directly provided by Spring. You can also have a good integration of Spring with real caching frameworks. EHCache, OSCache. Spring really provides really good interfacing with caching frameworks. So you can enable the caching frameworks by saying, by using, for example, the example for EHCache is shown here, EHCache Cache Manager, and you are
Let's just skip ahead a little bit. Let's see what the next question is.
defining algorithm I would want to use. Is it least implementation which is provided by Spring? Important features of Spring Batch program are restartability. That's basically if I run a batch program and it fails in between, then Spring Batch provides a feature to pick up from where it left off. Let's say there are 5 steps, third step failed. I can start executing from step 3 directly with Spring Batch. That's a very important feature of Spring Batch. It also provides different readers which enable me to talk to different things and get all the values from. So I can talk to JMS, read from a queue. I can talk to JDBC, read from a database. I can use Hibernate to read from a ORM.
This is a good explanation, and this is a good question to sort of go over before an interview, I think.
Kind of setup. I can use iBatis, or I can also write to all this kind of stuff. So that's very flexible features. I mean, Spring Batch enables me to easily read from these and write to these particular things. Typically, that's what we do in a batch. What do we do in a batch? We read from somewhere and write to somewhere. We do read from somewhere, process it, write to somewhere. So that's basically the features which Spring Batch provides through different readers and writers. The other important features is chunk processing. Let's say I have a million objects to process. If you process all of these at the same time, then the memory might not be sufficient, and all that kind of performance related things would come in. Probably you are holding the lock on a database for a long time. To avoid it, you can process in terms of batches. You can process in terms of chunks. Instead of processing 1 million items at a time, you can process 1,000 at a time, 10,000 at a time. All these features Spring provides. You can, this number 10,000 or 1,000 is configurable. So you can decide at a later point in time, I want to process 1 lakh at a time, 100,000 at a time, or 1,000 at a time. So that's the features that Spring Batch provides. And it also enables you to implement easy transaction management when you are doing chunk processing. The other important feature of Spring Batch is parallel processing. Let's say I have 5 steps and I want to process step 1 and step 2 in parallel with step 3 and step 4. That's allowed with Spring Batch. That's possible with Spring Batch. So those are the important features of Spring Batch framework. You can look up our website javainterview.in, and there are a lot of other questions which we didn't discuss in this video. There are a lot of stuff in there, a lot of other questions, the examples which we covered during this video and examples which we didn't cover during this video. So take a look down there and see if you find something useful. Thanks for watching this video. Until next time, bye.
That was a good one. Well done, Java interview. I think that was a good one to kind of go through.
Hi there.
Oops.
Welcome to this.
So let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that list. I'm
Hi
just
there. Welcome.
No, where's our list? So I'm just going through some of the results here, and I think maybe we'll cover some of these other ones another time. I don't know if you like this kind of format where we go through some existing Q&A I was hoping to maybe next in the next video we'll focus more on Spring Boot itself exclusively instead of a more generic Spring Framework type of thing. I think when you're if you're going for well, this is maybe a good video to go through if you're interviewing for Spring Framework. And if you're interviewing for Spring Boot, there's going to be some discussion of the Spring Framework that really can't be helped because they're integral. One is an integral component of the other. So that's it for this video today. We went through a few videos, went through the Q&A a lot, and you could see right away that there was a lot of sort of similar questions. So I don't know how relevant some of those are in an interview setting. I think, don't worry too much on what is, some of those really beginner questions, like why choose Spring Framework. I think if you're getting questions like that, then I don't know, I would be a little bit concerned about the organization that you're interviewing for. I think if they should be focused on, what kind of, things that Spring Boot offers in terms of, higher level concepts that we can execute with Spring Boot, and your sort of understanding of them, like your basic understanding of Spring Security. How does that work? Or how does the web dispatcher servlet work? Things like that, right? As opposed to describing things that are easy to find in the Spring Boot documentation. So yeah, that's kind of a list of some of those Q&A videos we've gone through. If you want to see more videos like this, just leave a comment in the comment section below. I'll put links to all of these in the description. And that's it for me today. Thanks a lot for dropping by, everyone. Have a good one. Peace.